All right, Alexander, let's do an update on Ukraine and what's going on there, what's going on the ground. I've heard some reports that the Russians now are also doing some counteroffensives in Kharkov. Nothing of significance. I don't want to overstate it, but there's Ukraine counteroffensives. There's Ukraine offensives in Kharkov. There's Russian. I mean, it seems very like typical mobile maneuvering warfare there. But Kherson, nothing's really moving there, even though Ukraine is trying. But Bakhmut, that is, I think, the big story is Bakhmut. And it looks like, I'll say one more thing. It looks like Russia is turning up the dial just a little bit more as far as their activity in Ukraine. You're seeing more missile strikes. There was a report from the Ministry of Defense that they actually took out an academy, U.S. mercenary, I guess, training camp or something like that, command center. They actually took that out with a strike as well, if you believe the report from the Ministry of Defense, hitting critical infrastructure, the dams, all these things. It does look like Russia is turning the dial up just a notch or two. And what else is going on in Ukraine on the ground? I think I don't want to say it's slow, but outside of Bakhmut and what's going on there, it just seems like it's the Russians just continue to annihilate the Ukraine military, it seems, which follows along the doctrine of Clausewitz, which is something we've been reporting on since the very beginning. They're at war with the army of Ukraine. It seems like that's what's happening. Anyway, those are just my quick thoughts. Well, what's going on the ground?
I think you got it exactly. And now I'd also heard these reports about a Russian offensive or counteroffensive in Kharkiv region. It's all very tentative and unclear at the moment. I would say it's not something to be completely discounted. I mean, there's a man called Gleb Bazov, who is a very authoritative Russian commentator on these matters with interesting political views, which I'm not going to talk about. I mean, he's basically, a supporter of the Soviet Union and all that. But, putting all that aside, his reporting tends to be pretty reliable about military developments. And what he said is that the Russians are sending, more forces to this area, to Kharkiv, and that they're gradually building up, and they'll be knocking out some Ukrainian positions, and that they're preparing some, offensive of their own. How big or limited it is, whether they're even planning to do that or not, who knows. The one thing one can say about Kharkiv, the one thing that's confirmed and corroborated by everyone, is that those the Iranian drones that we were hearing so much about, and about which I was intensely skeptical, it now looks as if they have finally appeared, and they're being used by the Russians in Kharkiv region, and they're being used to, they're small suicide drones, as it turns out, and they're being used to knock out, and apparently they've been quite effective, knocking out Ukrainian vehicles and armoured vehicles and those sort of things. But okay, let's all get bogged down in a discussion with the minutiae of the battles in Kharkiv region, about which we don't know very much. Kherson region, exactly what you said, very little movement on the ground there. Zaporozhye region, Ugledar, you remember we were going to hear lots about Ukrainian offensives in those regions. It seems that's not going to happen now. It seems there's large Russian military forces there. It seems that an offensive in those directions would be impossible, in effect. So one gets a sense of an awful lot of, boxing, shadow boxing going on in all sorts of theatres. In, Kherson region, the Ukrainians are still trying their things. Kharkiv region, one advances, one retreats, one crosses the river, the other counter crosses, that sort of thing. But you're absolutely right. The real fighting, the real battle is going on in in Donbass, where it always has been happening. And every day now, we hear of the noose around Bakhmut, this big fortified city that's supposedly the linchpin of the Ukrainian defense in Donbass, that the noose is tightening. I mean, only this morning I heard that the Russians had captured another factory there, a champagne factory, and that they've now reached the central residential areas of the city. It's quite likely, if we follow the same pattern that we've seen with other battles in cities that have taken place in the Ukraine war, that beyond a certain point, we're suddenly going to see a storming operation, and that the Russians are going to just throw in a large number of troops, and they're going to burst through the residential areas, capture, the main ones, isolate whatever Ukrainian troops are left there, and take over the whole place, even as they've cut off the main roads. So that is the real big battle that is taking place. There's a secondary battle, which is also important, about which we're even less informed, but which is apparently important, and that is that the Russians, or to be more precise, the Donetsk militia, with Russian artillery and air support, are now steadily clearing Ukrainian fortified positions around Donetsk city. But if you look at what the Ukrainian General Staff are talking about when they discuss the war in Ukraine, they are fully honed in on the fighting in Donbass, just as the Russians are. That's where the real battle is going on, and has been ever since April. So that's where the real fighting is happening. That's where the largest numbers of people who've been killed in hand-to-hand fighting is really taking place, and where Ukraine is desperately trying to cling on, and where they're gradually and methodically being ground down. Now, you're absolutely right in terms of Russian turning up the dial. We're now starting to see actually an increase in Russian missile strikes. Do you remember how, the Russians were about to run out of missiles? Remember reading that in the early first week of March, and then periodically ever since? Well, Russian missile strikes are growing in number. Apparently, according to the Ukrainians, some of them have involved use of Kinzhal missiles. They're now increasingly openly being directed at the energy system, dams, those kind of things. In other words, Ukrainian infrastructure, which up to this point the Russians have avoided. And one gets the sense that as winter is closing in, and as the economic pressure on Ukraine generally grows, the Russians are taking steps to start grinding the Ukrainian economy down, just as they're grinding the Ukrainian army down. And I think that's the bigger picture, which many people miss when they focus too much, on, a platoon advanced there, a platoon retreated here, a river crossing took place there, somebody shelled someone over here. We need to keep an eye always in understanding this war on the big picture. And the big picture is of Russian advances in Donbass, of this major fortified zone, Bakhmut and around Donetsk, steadily being taken apart, and at the same time of the increasing pressure on the Ukrainian army and on the Ukrainian civilian economy, which up to now has sustained it.
So it seems like every time the Ukraine military is in a bind, when things are going poorly with regards to Ukraine in Donbass, they fall back on shelling Donetsk city, and we have seen an uptick there as well. We're getting reports that around 12 people have died from the increased shelling of Donetsk city by the Ukraine military. So every time you see a Russian advance, it feels like the Ukraine military falls back on just this shelling into Donetsk city. And that's how you know that things are going poorly for them in Donbass. I mean, is that a correct statement to make?
That is an exactly correct statement to make. And can I just say that there is actually a rationale behind this? I mean, it's not one that I'm Well, I want to make clear I endorse at all. On the contrary, I repudiate it entirely. But one can see a logic behind this because the key place, the key position is Bakhmut. Bakhmut is coming close to falling. So what Ukraine is trying to do is it's trying to divert Russia's focus away from Bakhmut and redirect it back to Donetsk. Now, one of the reasons this battle in Bakhmut has taken as long as it has is because way back in July, when logically the Russians should have focused everything they had on Bakhmut, they had to divert forces instead to clearing these Ukrainian fortified positions, heavily fortified positions near Donetsk city, because they were coming under heavy political pressure from the people of Donetsk city, who, remember, the Russians said they went in to defend and to liberate, and from the political and militia leaders of Donetsk region. Now, the Russians can't just ignore these people. If they did ignore these people, the people in Donetsk city, in the political and military leadership of the Donetsk Republic, would start to say to themselves, the Russians aren't here to look up, to defend us, to protect us, which is what they say. They're here to fight some bigger strategic war, which is in their interests, but perhaps less so in ours. So there's this constant pressure from people in Donetsk city to do something to end this shelling. And that meant, if you go back to July, that the Russians had to divide their forces. They focused some of their forces on taking Bakhmut, and they had to send other forces to start clearing these fortified positions in and around Donetsk. So it's worked in a kind of a way for Ukraine, because otherwise, if this hadn't been happening, all of those forces would have been committed to taking Bakhmut, which would probably have been taken by now. So you can see the kind of logic, which is what they're doing. So they sense that things in Bakhmut city are going badly wrong for them, that the Russians have now penetrated into the residential areas, that they're tightening their noose around Bakhmut city. So they want to distract the Russians, get the Russians to send reinforcements to Donetsk instead, get the Russians to divert artillery firepower and air power to Donetsk city instead, which will give the garrison in Bakhmut city a little bit more time, a little more space, which perhaps Ukraine can then use to rush reinforcements there. So it has a kind of logic. It's one that the Russian command fully understands and can do a certain amount about, but of course they can't counter it entirely. Now, I think we are reaching soon the point where it's really not going to be practical to continue with this for very much longer, because Bakhmut city looks increasingly undefendable. And of course, the Russians have actually managed to make a lot of inroads in the fortified Ukrainian positions around Donetsk. So they're coming close to solving this problem. But you can understand why, as soon as things start to go wrong, the Ukrainians do this. And as you absolutely rightly say, it's a very good indicator that for Ukraine, things are going wrong when they do this.
Right. It sounds contrary to what's happening. A shelling of Donetsk city means that things are going badly for Ukraine, but that is the case.
That's exactly the case.
The Artemovsk's champagne factory. Alexander,
that's right.
That's the champagne factory, and a lot of this work is being done by the Wagner musicians, as they are called, as they're often referred to. Why is Bakhmut so important? What happens if Bakhmut falls? Zelensky was giving his address yesterday, and he said that Ukraine is still focused on taking over Kherson and Mariupol and other cities. Mostly, the list was for cities in the southeast region, but Zelensky was adamant that Ukraine is going to, quote unquote, liberate these cities, take these cities back. Do you think there's any sense of reality to that? And finally, a final question: long-range missiles. The Biden White House under extreme pressure to provide long-range missiles. Has the U.S. already provided those long-range missiles, or is Biden actually considering it?
Yeah, right. Let's start
questions.
with a bunch of questions. Let's start with whether Ukraine can retake these places in the southeast. Now, if we're talking about Mariupol, I would say not a chance. I mean, whatever happens, the Russians are going to defend Mariupol. I mean, it is an absolutely key location in Donetsk. It's within Donetsk itself. It's part of the Donbass. There is absolutely no conceivable way the Russians will allow Ukraine to recapture Donetsk city. Mariupol. For that to happen, Russia would have to lose the war. I mean, it's as straightforward as that. I mean, so long as Russia is able to keep fighting, they will hold on to Mariupol. I have to say, I think the same is true in Kherson. I mean, I think, I'm making a guess here, but I think that there must be some Russian commanders who are saying that it was actually a mistake to take Kherson city, that they should have stayed on the east bank of the Dnieper, and that, pushing their forces west beyond the Dnieper to take Kherson city, which was obviously an attractive prize, has exposed large Russian forces to a difficult situation where there's no very clear defense line. But again, I have to say this, I think Kherson is too important, too prestigious for the Russians to abandon it. So whilst I think there's slightly more of a possibility that Ukraine might be able to achieve something there, I have to say I think that's extremely unlikely, and their entire offensive directed at Kherson has been a complete failure up to this point. Now, something may happen dramatically that could change that picture, but I have to say I think that is unlikely. Why is Bakhmut important, so important? The short answer is that it is, from everything I've been told by people who understand these things, it is the major defense point for what is, if not the ultimate, certainly the penultimate line of Ukrainian defense in Donbass. If Bakhmut city falls, then the Russians are going to advance on Kramatorsk, which is the one big remaining city Ukraine still controls in Donbass. And from what I've heard, Kramatorsk is much more difficult to defend than Bakhmut. It's not got the sort of hinterland of small towns and villages to its west that Bakhmut city has, and it could be much more easily encircled, and the Ukrainian forces there could be much more easily destroyed than Bakhmut city. So if Bakhmut city falls, then the entire Ukrainian position in Donbass starts to unravel, and that will then lead to a cascade effect. Kramatorsk, after Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and then the war in Donbass is effectively at an end. I mean, the Ukrainians could, in theory, try something in northern Lugansk region. There's some talk that, they might be trying something there. I think, again, these are distraction exercises rather than real attempts to recapture significant ground there. That's, my opinion. As I said, I often say I'm not a grand strategist, I'm not a military man, but that's how it looks to me. I mean, the numbers of troops involved are very small. Why isn't Zelensky talking about this? Well, he doesn't want to talk about this because he doesn't want to talk about the fact that Bakhmut is about to fall. So he's talking instead about these victories that he's going to win in Mariupol, in Kherson, in all of these other places, even though he hasn't achieved those victories up to now. So that explains him. Now, about these long-range missiles, I don't know whether or not they've yet been delivered to Ukraine. There's been rumours that they have been. I am convinced that sooner or later they will be delivered to Ukraine. The Russians have said if they are delivered to Ukraine, Russia will consider the United States a direct participant in the war in Ukraine. Now, I don't know what that means, but that's what the Russians have said. They make it sound like that will be a very serious development indeed. But the entire response of the Biden White House to Ukraine developments is that when it looks as if Ukraine is going to lose, they escalate. It looks again as if Ukraine is going to lose. So sooner or later, they're going to escalate. And there's a big head of steam in the United States amongst Ukraine's many friends there, the lobbyists, all those people, to get the United States to send these long-range missiles. Ukraine obviously is pushing hard to get these long-range missiles. I fully expect that sooner or later, one way or the other, we will see these long-range missiles appear and start to be used in Ukraine. How much difference they will make in terms of the battlefields, I don't know. I doubt very much for what it's worth, but certainly the Russians have made it absolutely clear that in that case, they will react strongly to their deployment.
Yeah, I don't even want to speculate what could happen, but obviously the long-range missiles are meant to hit Russian Federation territory. I would imagine
absolutely,
Crimea
absolutely.
and stuff like that. That's
absolutely
the first thing that pops to my mind. But anyway, another way to escalate is by creating a second front, Alexander, and we have developments in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Nancy Pelosi made a trip to Armenia. She's like the John McCain replacement, it seems. Wherever she turns up now, trouble is going to follow her. So she's kind of taken over for John McCain, and they sent her to places to stir up trouble. Anyway, one of the ways that the U.S. escalates with regards to Ukraine, and more to the fact with regards to Russia, because that's what this really is all about, is they're trying to open up a second front. We've talked about Georgia and Moldova and Serbia. But they may have something, maybe, they may have something with regards to Armenia and Azerbaijan. Pelosi, she said it straight up, leave the CSTO, come join the U.S., break away from Russia, and we'll give you everything you need to protect yourselves and to take on Azerbaijan, etc. That was pretty much her message. That was her deal.
Yes.
What do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, it is a deal, and it's entirely possible that some people in Armenia who must feel under immense pressure and who must have seen these pictures of Putin with Erdogan and Aliyev in Samarkand, that they might be attracted to it. And, I can't say that that's not going to happen. If they are led up this particular garden path, then to be absolutely clear, it will be a garden path because the United States is not going to help Armenia. How can it? In what conceivable way could the United States send support to Armenia? Turkey would oppose it. Russia, of course, would oppose it. Azerbaijan has military superiority over Armenia. Iran, the other great power in the area, would oppose it too. So I think it would be a disastrous mistake for the Armenians to make, but I can believe that there might be some people in Armenia who might be drawn to it. But you're absolutely right. Do that. Leverage Armenia out of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Spread a story about Armenia being, stabbed in the back, abandoned by Russia. Say that the United States will come to Armenia's rescue. It's exactly the kind of thing that someone like Pelosi might say, and it's exactly the kind of thing which some people might listen to, and it will lead Armenia to disaster if they follow it.
You were about to say Ukraine, but I think that's a very smart. That was about to be a very smart slip of the tongue, because the fate that would await Armenia if they were to leave the CSTO and to realign with NATO and the US and the EU would be absolutely disastrous. In my opinion, it would be absolutely disastrous.
Absolutely disastrous. I mean, Armenia does not have strong cards, and its neighbourhood is very difficult. Bear in mind that it would antagonize Turkey. I mean, if Turkey saw the US moving into Armenia and supporting Armenia against Azerbaijan, that would consolidate Turkey's support for Azerbaijan, but it would also consolidate the ongoing rapprochement between Turkey and Russia. And what, for example, if the Turks, in response, closed the straits? How would US ships reach Armenia? Now, you could send military aid, in theory, by aircraft, but aircraft can be shot down. So it's not going to happen. It would be a impossible thing to do. But I don't think the United States has any real plan to help Armenia in this situation. But I'm afraid, and I can well believe, that there are some people in Armenia who think it might happen, who might
And very
be
quickly,
attracted
Iran.
to it. Yeah. And Iran would react.
And Iran's stance, real quick.
Well, I
You
mean,
mentioned
Iran
them,
would be,
and not many people
would be,
talk about Iran with
no,
regards
of course
to this.
not.
To this
No,
conflict.
of course not. Even though Iran has been friendly to Armenia historically, Iran would be solidly opposed. Every one of the big powers in the region, Russia, Turkey, Iran, would be strongly opposed to a US presence in Armenia. And that would, as I said, green light whatever attack on Armenia Azerbaijan might have in mind. And Azerbaijan, as it's shown, now has military superiority over Armenia. This would be a disastrous thing for Armenia to do. But, as I said, I can believe that there are some people who might be swept along by it.
Yeah. All right, that's the second front, it appears. Any other countries, very quickly, before I close it out, that the U.S. could be focusing on with the second front?
Yeah, I mean,
or is it Armenia seems to be what they're zeroing in?
Armenia is the major place at the moment. I mean, there's been fighting between Kazakhstan and Tajikistan. Difficult to quite fully work out what's going on there, but there's been fighting there. It's not impossible. The US has been involved in some way, though the Russians seem to be getting on top of that one. The other place where it seems the US has not given up is Kazakhstan. You remember there was that crisis in Kazakhstan about a year ago, but it seems that there's still people in Kazakhstan. There's still attempts in Kazakhstan to create problems in the situation there. The new government that was created as a result of the fall of Nazarbayev is only gradually consolidating its authority. So, it's possible that something might be attempted there too. But, I mean, certainly the Russians and the Chinese have to keep a very close watch on what's going on in Central Asia. It's a major place of concern, and the situation isn't resolved. And even a few months ago, there were even problems in Uzbekistan. Remember, the Samarkand summit happened in Uzbekistan. There's lots of, problems, ethnicities, divisions, arguments between the various people there. You want to create mischief. This is an easy place to do it. So far, the Russians and the Chinese and the local governments have been very effective in putting the fires out. But we can't discount the possibility that some kind of a fire will be lit all the same.
Okay. We will end it there, theduran.locals.com, and check us out on Odyssey, Rumble, BitChute, and Telegram. Take care.